In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, a knock on the door in the dead of night could mean a swift death or a desperate plea. For Sarah Jenkins, a widow struggling to keep her remote inn from crumbling into the desert, that knock brought both. It was a man half dead and with the law hot on his heels. Taking him in was a fool's gamble, a risk that could cost her everything she had left. But in the Wild West, sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most unexpected salvation. This is the story of how a single act of pity rebuilt an inn and then a life. The wind was a restless spirit that night, howling through the canyons and rattling the very bones of the traveler's wall. Sarah Jenkins's lonely outpost on the edge of the Arizona Territory. Each gust felt like a claw scraping at the weathered clapboard, a constant reminder of how close everything was to falling apart. The inn her late husband's dream had become her gilded cage, a legacy of debt and dust. It had been a year since Thomas had been taken by the fever, leaving Sarah with nothing but the deed to a failing business and a heart hollowed out by grief. The sign out front, once a proud declaration of hospitality, now swung on a single hinge, creaking a mournful rhythm with the wind. Dust coated everything, a fine red powder that seeped through the cracks in the walls and settled on the empty tables in the common room like a shroud. Tonight, the storm outside was a mirror to the one inside her. A letter from the bank in Prescott lay on the table. Its stark black ink, a death sentence for her home. They wanted their money, an impossible sum that Thomas had borrowed with buoyant optimism, certain that the coming railroad would bring a flood of prosperity. But the railroad was delayed, and prosperity was just a word whispered by ghosts in the empty rooms upstairs. Suddenly, a sound cut through the gale, sharper and more urgent than the wind's mournful cry, a frantic, desperate pounding on the main door. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Travelers were rare these days, and those who did come were usually hard men with flinty eyes best not to be trifled with. She reached under the counter of the empty bar, her hand closing around the cold, familiar stock of Thomas's old shotgun. Her knuckles were white as she crept towards the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling but firm. A man's voice, raspy and weak, answered from the other side. "Please, help me. I'm hurt." Sarah hesitated, the shotgun heavy in her hands. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore the plea, to let the storm swallow the stranger whole. This was a land that preyed on the soft-hearted. But then another sound reached her, faint but unmistakable, the distant baying of hounds. Not coyotes, bloodhounds. A shiver of a different kind ran down her spine. A hunted man. This was trouble of the worst kind, the kind that brought lawmen and bounty hunters violence and destruction. She should bar the door, douse the lamps, and pray they passed her by. But the plea came again, closer to a groan this time. "Please." Something in that sound, a raw thread of desperation that echoed her own, broke through her fear. She thought of Thomas, how he would have opened the door without a second thought, his faith in the goodness of strangers, as wide as the desert sky. Cursing her own weakness, she slid the heavy bolt back and cracked the door open. The man who staggered in was more dead than alive. He was tall, but his frame was gaunt, his clothes torn and stained with dirt, and something darker. A makeshift bandage was tied around his thigh, soaked through with blood. His face, shadowed by a thick, untamed beard, was pale and drawn, but his eyes, when they met hers, were a startlingly clear blue, blazing with a fierce, hunted light. He collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're coming," rasped, his gaze fixed on the door. "You have to hide me." Sarah's mind raced. The hounds were closer now. She could hear the shouts of men on horseback. She had seconds to decide. To turn him out was to sentence him to death. To hide him was to make herself an accomplice to invite the wrath of the law down upon her already fragile world. She looked at the man, at the blood pooling on her floorboards, at the terror and defiance warring in his eyes. And in that moment, she didn't see a fugitive, a criminal, or a threat. She saw a fellow soul drowning in the same merciless tide that was pulling her under. "Get up!" She ordered, her voice sharp with an authority she didn't feel. "Now!" With her help, he hobbled towards the back of the inn, leaving a smeared trail of blood on the dusty floor. She led him not to one of the empty guest rooms, but to the root cellar, its entrance hidden beneath a thick bearskin rug in her private kitchen. The air that rose to meet them was cool and damp, smelling of earth and potatoes. "Stay here. Don't make a sound no matter what you hear," she commanded, her eyes locking with his. He nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Gratitude, respect. He sank down onto the dirt floor, his back against a row of pickle barrels, and she pulled the heavy cellar door closed, dragging the rug back over it, just as the hounds began to bark frantically to right outside the inn. Seconds later, the front door burst open. The man who stood there was the physical embodiment of the law in this part of the territory, Marshal John Corbin. He was a bull of a man with a thick moustache and a cold, unforgiving stare that had made hardened outlaws confess their sins. Behind him, 2 deputies fanned out their rifles at the ready, Mrs. Jenkins Corbin's voice boomed, dripping with false pleasantry. "A storm seems to have brought us to your door." Marshal Sarah said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She forced her hands to remain steady, to not betray the tremor that threatened to shake her apart. "What can I do for you?" Corbin's eyes swept the room, lingering on the empty tables, the dusty bar, the general air of neglect. His gaze was dismissive, almost contemptuous. "We're tracking a fugitive, a murderer by the name of Caleb Blackwood, killed a deputy over in the Tonto Basin. We tracked him this far, but the storms washed out the trail." "You seen anyone tonight?" "A man on foot wounded." Sarah's blood ran cold. A murderer. She was hiding a man who had killed a lawman. The weight of her decision settled on her like a physical blow. She could feel Caleb Blackwood's presence beneath her feet, a secret that could burn her world to ashes. She met the marshal's gaze, her expression a carefully constructed mask of weary indifference. "Just the wind and the rain." "Marshal, I've been alone all night." Corbin stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to sniff out a lie like a predator scenting its prey. He took a slow step into the room, his boots echoing on the floorboards. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of a disturbance. Then his gaze fell on the floor, on the faint, almost invisible smear of red leading towards the back of the inn. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the howling of the wind and the frantic beating of Sarah's own heart. Corbin bent down his fingers, brushing against the stain. He brought them to his nose, his expression unreadable. "What's this?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. Sarah's mind worked frantically, grasping for a plausible lie. I cut myself," she stammered, holding up her hand as if for inspection. "A broken glass earlier. Clumsy of me." Corbin looked from her hand to the floor, then back to her face. He didn't believe her. She could see it in the cold glint in his eyes. He knew she was lying. He took another step, his gaze now fixed on the kitchen door on the bearskin rug that lay just beyond it. He was going to find him. He was going to tear her in apart, drag the murderer from the cellar, and she would be ruined, imprisoned, another victim of the unforgiving West. Her life, as she knew it, was over. Marshal Corbin's gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on Sarah, threatening to crack her fragile composure. He took a deliberate step towards the kitchen, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. The two deputies flanked him, their rifles held loosely but ready. The air was thick with unspoken suspicion. "You'll forgive me, Mrs. Jenkins," Corbin said, his voice a low growl, "but I'll need to have a look around. For your own safety, of course." It wasn't a request. Sarah's mind spun a frantic dance of panic and prayer. The cellar, the rug, the blood. It was all so flimsy, a child's defense against a wolf. She had to do something, create a diversion, anything to keep him from that kitchen. As Corbin pushed past her, his shoulder brushing hers with deliberate force, an idea born of pure desperation sparked in her mind. It was a wild, reckless gamble, a leap into a fire to escape a flood. "Marshal, wait," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the kitchen. He stopped, his eyes narrowing with emotions. "I'm not in the mood for games, widow." "This isn't a game," she said, looking him straight in the eye. She let a calculated tremor enter her voice, a performance of a woman on the edge. "There is something you should see. But not here, not with them." She flicked her eyes towards the deputies. Corbin was intrigued. He was a man who thrived on secrets and leverage. He motioned for his deputies to stay put, their faces etched with confusion. "All right, Mrs. Jenkins, lead the way." But this had better be worth my time. Sarah led him not to the kitchen, but up the creaking staircase to the second floor, to the room at the very end of the hall. It had been her and Thomas's room. She hadn't slept in it since he died. The air was stale thick with the scent of lavender and sorrow. She walked to the large ornate wardrobe that stood against the far wall. It was Thomas's pride and joy, carved from dark, heavy oak. She took a deep breath, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. "What is this, Mrs. Jenkins?" Corbin demanded, his patience wearing thin. "Evidence," she whispered, pulling the wardrobe door open. It was empty. Or rather, it appeared empty. But Sarah reached inside her fingers, finding a small hidden latch in the back panel. A section of the wood swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. A secret compartment. From within, she pulled out a leather-bound ledger. She held it out to Corbin, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. He took it, his brow furrowed in suspicion. He opened it, his eyes scanning the neat columns of figures and names. His expression slowly changed from skepticism to a focused, predatory interest. "What am I looking at?" he asked, though he already knew. "My husband's accounts." Sarah said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. He was not the man everyone thought he was. Marshal. He did business with unsavory characters. Smugglers. Men running from the law. He kept a record of everything. Names, dates, payments. He used this inn as a safe house. It was a monstrous lie, a desecration of Thomas's memory. He had been the most honest man she had ever known, but his honesty hadn't saved him, and it wouldn't save her. Corbin's eyes lit up with a greedy, triumphant light. This was a gold mine, a ledger detailing a network of criminals passing through his territory. It was a career-making discovery. It was leverage power and promotion, all bound in cheap leather. "Why show me this now?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Because I'm drowning, Marshal," Sarah said, letting the genuine desperation she felt flood her voice. "The bank is foreclosing. I'm about to lose everything. This book, it's all I have left to bargain with." Corbin closed the ledger with a snap. The sound echoed in the quiet room. He looked at her, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He understood. He held the key to her survival, and she had just handed him the key to his ambition. "I see," he said. "So the fugitive Caleb Blackwood. He is not here, I swear on my husband's grave, Marshal." She said the words, a bitter irony. "I have seen no one tonight." He stared at her for a long moment, weighing her words, weighing the value of the ledger in his hand. He knew she was lying about Blackwood. The bloodstain downstairs was a loose thread he could still pull. But the ledger was a tapestry of conspiracy he could unravel for years. "All right, Mrs. Jenkins," he said, finally, tucking the book inside his coat. "I'll take you at your word. For now." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "This ledger stays between us. My deputies don't need to know where it came from. In return, I'll have a word with the bank manager in Prescott, see if we can't come to a more agreeable arrangement." He was letting her off the hook, but putting a new, more dangerous one in its place. She was no longer just a struggling innkeeper. She was his informant, his asset bound to him by a lie and a book of ghosts. And Mrs. Jenkins, he added, his eyes like chips of ice. "If I ever find out you've lied to me about anything else, I will burn this place to the ground with you inside it. Do we have an understanding?" "Perfectly, Marshal," she whispered, her body trembling with the aftermath of her gamble. He gave a curt nod and descended the stairs. A moment later, she heard the front door slam shut, the sound of the horses and hounds fading into the storm. She was safe. For now. She sank onto the dusty bed, the shotgun sliding from her numb fingers and clattering to the floor. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the storm. She had made a deal with the devil, trading her integrity for her survival. After what felt like an eternity, she forced herself to her feet and went downstairs. She slid the bearskin rug aside and pulled open the heavy cellar door. Caleb Blackwood looked up, his face a pale mask in the gloom. He had heard everything. The muffled voices, the heavy footsteps, the final slamming door. "He's gone?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "He's gone," she confirmed, her voice hollow. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the cellar wall. "You lied for me. You risked everything." "Yes," she said, her gaze hard. "I did. And you have no idea what it just cost me." She looked at him, the murderer, the source of her damnation. There was no gratitude in her heart, only a cold, simmering rage. "Now you're my problem, Mr. Blackwood, and you're going to start paying your debt. Thomas, my husband, he left this place to fall apart. You're going to help me rebuild it. You owe me that much." His clear blue eyes met hers across the dim, earthy space. There was no fear in them now, only a quiet, unnerving intensity. He gave a slow nod. "All right, Mrs. Jenkins," he said. "You have a deal." It was another bargain struck in the shadows, built on a foundation of lies and blood. A partnership between a desperate widow and a hunted killer, with the ruins of an old life as their common ground, and the faint hope of a new one their only prize. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The wind had died, leaving behind a sky washed clean, and a world that seemed to be holding its breath. For Sarah, the silence was a constant reminder of the secret lurking in her cellar. A murderer. Her partner. She found Caleb Blackwood awake, his back against the damp stone wall, his wounded legs stretched out stiffly before him. The fever had taken hold. A sheen of sweat covered his brow, and his clear blue eyes were clouded with pain. The makeshift bandage was a sodden, useless rag. "That wound needs tending," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. There was no room for pity now, only for the grim reality of their bargain. "If you die on me, you're no use to anyone." She brought back a basin of hot water, clean cloths, and a bottle of carbolic acid. As she knelt to unwrap the wound, she braced herself for a gruesome sight. It was worse than she had imagined. A deep, ragged gash high on his thigh, the flesh around it angry and inflamed. A bullet wound. "Who shot you?" she asked, her voice low as she began to clean the injury. He flinched, hissing through his teeth, but his voice was steady. "The deputy I supposedly killed." Sarah paused, her hands hovering over the wound. Supposedly, Caleb's gaze was direct, unwavering. "He's not dead, Mrs. Jenkins. I shot him in the leg, same as he shot me." It was a fair fight until his friends showed up. Sarah didn't know whether to believe him. Every instinct for self-preservation told her he was a liar, a killer spinning a tale to gain her sympathy. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw not the cold emptiness of a murderer, but a deep, burning well of injustice. It was the same fire she had seen in his eyes when he'd first stumbled through her door. She said nothing, returning to her task. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient and sure. She had tended to Thomas through his final, fevered days, a skill she had prayed she would never need again. After cleaning and disinfecting the wound as best she could, she stitched it closed with a needle and thread from her sewing kit. Her stitches small and neat. He bore the pain in stoic silence, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. "You've done this before." He observed, his voice tight. "My husband," was all she said. For the next few days, the cellar was his sick room. Sarah brought him food and water, changed his bandages, and listened to the fevered ramblings that offered fragmented glimpses into his past. A name Elias whispered with a mix of love and regret. A mention of a silver mine. The bitter taste of betrayal. Each fragment was a puzzle piece, but they formed no coherent picture, only deepening the mystery of the man she had chained herself to. Slowly the fever broke. The color returned to his face, and the clarity to his eyes. He began to move around the cellar, testing his leg. His restlessness, a palpable force in the confined space. "I can't stay down here forever," he said one evening, his voice regaining its strength. "A man goes mad without the sun, and a man goes to the gallows if he's seen," she countered. "Marshal Corbin is not a man who forgets. He'll be watching this place." "Then I'll work at night," Caleb insisted. "You said you wanted this inn rebuilt. Let me start." And so began a strange nocturnal partnership. While the territory slept, The traveller's rest came alive with the quiet sounds of labor. Caleb, it turned out, was a man who knew how to build. He had a carpenter's hands, strong and calloused, and an architect's eye. He moved with a quiet, purposeful energy that was a stark contrast to Sarah's weary resignation. He started with the swinging sign out front. Under the pale light of the moon, he took it down, mended the broken hinge with a piece of scavenged metal, and sanded the weathered wood until it was smooth. He didn't repaint the faded letters, but his careful repair was a small act of defiance against the decay, a single note of hope in a symphony of despair. Next, he turned his attention to the porch. The floorboards were rotten, a treacherous landscape of splintered wood. Night after night he worked, prying up the old planks and replacing them with new ones he salvaged from a collapsed shed out back. The rhythmic sound of his hammer was a secret pulse in the heart of the night, a sound only Sarah could hear. She would watch him from the doorway, a mug of coffee in her hands. She saw the way he moved, the economy of his motion, the focused intensity he brought to every task. He worked not like a man paying a debt, but like a man trying to build his way back to himself. One night, as he was setting a new post for the porch railing, she brought him a plate of food. He stopped his work and ate in silence, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "You're watching for them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Corbin's not the only one looking for me," he said, his voice low. "There are others. The men I was with at the silver mine. The men who betrayed you," she ventured, recalling his fevered whispers. He looked at her, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "You have good ears, Mrs. Jenkins." He paused, then seemed to come to a decision. "My brother Elias and we discovered a rich vein of silver up in the Bradshaws. We needed partners to work the claim, so we took on 2 men, Jackson and Miller. We trusted them." He fell silent, the muscle in his jaw working. "The silver was purer than we ever dreamed. We were going to be rich. But Jackson and Miller, they had other ideas. They wanted it all. They tried to kill us, to make it look like a cave-in. I managed to get out. Elias. He didn't." The grief in his voice was raw, a freshly opened wound. "They took the silver and vanished. They spread the word that I had killed my own brother and run off with the claim. Then I had a run-in with that deputy, and now I'm a wanted man for 2 crimes I didn't commit." Sarah listened, her skepticism warring with a growing sense of empathy. His story was wild, a tale of greed and betrayal worthy of a dime novel. But the pain in his eyes, the quiet dignity with which he spoke of his brother, felt undeniably real. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the half-finished porch railing. "You have no reason to, I suppose. But a man's got to hold on to the truth, even if no one else believes it. It's all I have left of my brother." He finished his food, stood up, and picked up his hammer. He struck a nail with a single, clean blow. The sound was sharp, definitive. It was the sound of a man building something new, even in the ruins of the old. It was the sound of the first stone being laid. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever hope. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, but it was there, as real and as solid as the new porch post standing sentinel in the moonlight. Weeks bled into a month. The rhythm of their lives settled into a strange, secret harmony. By day, Sarah ran the inn, a ghost haunting her own empty establishment, presenting a facade of normalcy to the occasional passerby. By night, the inn transformed. Under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky, Caleb worked, and Sarah watched, and the space between them, once filled with suspicion and fear, began to fill with something else. Caleb's work was a quiet miracle. The new porch was solid underfoot, the railing no longer a jagged row of broken teeth. He moved inside, tackling the common room next. He planed the warped floorboards until they were level, puttied the cracks in the walls, and reglazed the windows that had been rattling in their frames for years. He found a stash of Thomas's old furniture in the barn, pieces that had been deemed too broken to fix, and with a craftsman's patience, he brought them back to life. A chair with a broken leg stood steady once more. A table, its surface scarred and stained, was sanded down to reveal the beautiful grain of the wood beneath. The inn began to breathe again. The dust receded. The air, once heavy with neglect, started to feel lighter. It wasn't just the physical repairs. It was the care that went into them. Caleb worked with a reverence for the materials, a respect for the structure itself. He wasn't just fixing a building. He was healing it. And in healing the inn, he was healing something in Sarah too. Each repaired plank, each new pane of glass, was a small victory against the tide of despair that had threatened to consume her. She started to take pride in the place again, to see it not as a prison, but as a home. She found herself humming as she swept the newly leveled floors, a sound she hadn't made in over a year. Their conversations, once clipped and cautious, began to flow more easily in the quiet intimacy of the night. She learned about his childhood in Ohio, his dream of heading west with his brother, the fierce loyalty that bound them together. He was a good listener, and she found herself telling him about Thomas, not just the grief of his loss, but the joy of their life together, the shared dreams that had built this inn. "He would have liked you," she said, one night watching him expertly repair a squeaky door hinge. He admired a man who could work with his hands. Caleb paused, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "And what do you admire, Sarah?" It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his low, steady voice sent a strange shiver through her. She looked at him, at his strong, capable hands, at the intelligence and kindness that had begun to shine through the rough exterior of the fugitive. "I admire a man who keeps his promises," she said, softly. A fragile trust was being built between them, as carefully and deliberately as the inn itself. But they both knew their carefully constructed world was as precarious as a house of cards. The shadow of Marshal Corbin loomed large, a constant unspoken threat. He made good on his word to the bank. A letter arrived informing Sarah that her loan had been restructured. The payments were deferred, the interest lowered. It was a reprieve, but it was also a leash. Corbin owned her. He started stopping by the inn, his visits unannounced and unwelcome. He would sit at one of the newly repaired tables, a smug look on his face, and accept the cup of coffee she offered with a proprietary air. He never mentioned the ledger, but it was always there between them, a silent, ugly testament to their pact. "Place is looking better, Mrs. Jenkins," he remarked during one visit, running a hand over the smooth surface of the table Caleb had refinished. "Finding the money for repairs." "Are we?" "I'm resourceful, Marshal," she replied, her voice tight. "I'm sure you are," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Heard some whispers about your old friends. Jackson and Miller. Seems they've been seen over near the Mexican border flashing a lot of silver. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. If Corbin was looking into Jackson and Miller, it was only a matter of time before he started asking more questions about Caleb Blackwood, about the murdered brother, and the stolen claim. That night she told Caleb what Corbin had said. He listened, his face grim, his hands stilling their work. "He's not just watching you," Caleb said, his voice low and hard. "He's using you as bait. He thinks if Jackson and Miller are my enemies, they might come looking for me here. Or he thinks I'll get reckless and go after them myself." The fragile shelter they had built suddenly felt terribly exposed. The walls, so recently mended, seemed to offer no protection at all. The night, once their sanctuary, was now filled with unseen dangers. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, the fear she had kept at bay for weeks, returning with a vengeance. Caleb looked at her, his blue eyes intense. He reached out his calloused hand, gently touching her arm. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than accidental contact. His touch was warm, steady, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. "We keep building," he said, his voice a low rumble of defiance. "We make this place stronger. We don't run. We don't hide. We make our stand right here." It was a reckless, foolish plan. They were two people against the law, against a pair of ruthless killers, against the world. But as she looked at the inn, at the tangible proof of what they had built together, she believed him. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was their fortress. A fragile shelter, perhaps, but it was theirs. And for the first time she was ready to fight for it. The false sense of peace shattered on a blistering Tuesday in late August. Sarah was sweeping the porch, the one Caleb had rebuilt, with such care when two horses kicked up a cloud of dust on the horizon. It wasn't Marshal Corbin's sturdy gelding. These were rangy, hard-ridden animals, and the men on their backs had the lean, hungry look of wolves. As they drew closer, her blood ran cold. One was a big, beefy man with a florid face and a cruel twist to his mouth. The other was wiry and sallow, with shifty, rat-like eyes that darted everywhere at once. They matched the descriptions Caleb had given her, the ones burned into his memory. Jackson and Miller. They dismounted their spurs, jingling with a menacing sound on the porch steps. Caleb was in the barn, mending a harness safely out of sight. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, the broom held like a weapon in her hands. "Afternoon, ma'am, the big one," Jackson said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He tipped his hat with an exaggerated courtesy that didn't reach his cold eyes. "We're looking for a place to water our horses and get a drink that ain't full of sand. The water trough is out back," Sarah said, her voice betraying none of the terror she felt. "But the bar is closed." Miller, the wiry one, let out a high-pitched snicker. "Bars closed. In the middle of the day. That ain't very hospitable, ma'am." He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "We're looking for a friend of ours." Jackson cut in, his gaze sweeping over the newly repaired inn. "Goes by the name of Blackwood. Caleb Blackwood. Heard he might have passed this way." "I don't know the name." Sarah lied, her mouth dry. "That's funny," Miller said, circling her slowly. "Because we heard this inn has become a real sanctuary for folks in trouble. A place where a man can get lost with the help of a pretty widow." The implication hung in the hot, still air. Someone had talked. Someone had told them about her and Caleb. Had Corbin let it slip, trying to draw them out? Or was it just a lucky guess? "I think you've been misinformed," Sarah said, taking a step back. "Now I'll have to ask you to leave." Jackson laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I don't think so." He lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a brutally tight grip. "We're gonna have a look around, and you're gonna help us." Sarah cried out, struggling against his iron grasp, but it was useless. He dragged her towards the inn door. The plan was falling apart. They were going to find Caleb, and a bloodbath would follow. Suddenly, a voice, calm and deadly, cut through the air. "Let her go." Caleb stood in the barn doorway, not 20 yards away. He held no gun, only the harness he had been mending. But his posture, the cold fire in his blue eyes, was more threatening than any weapon. Jackson and Miller froze their heads, snapping towards the sound. A slow, predatory smile spread across Jackson's face. "Well, well. Look what the cat dragged in." "We were just asking this lovely lady where you were hiding, Caleb. Saved us the trouble of tearing this place apart. Your business is with me, Jackson," Caleb said, taking a slow step forward. "Leave her out of it." "Oh, she's in it now," Miller sneered, drawing his pistol with a flick of his wrist. He pointed it at Sarah's head. "Deep in it. Now you're gonna tell us where you hid the rest of the silver, or your lady friend here is gonna have a real bad day." Sarah's world narrowed to the cold, round opening of the gun barrel. This was it. The consequences of her single act of pity had finally come to collect their due. Caleb stopped, his face a mask of controlled fury. "There is no more silver. You took it all." "Don't lie to me," Jackson roared. Elias was the smart one. He would have had a stash hidden away. "You know where it is? I told you," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's nothing left." "Wrong answer," Jackson snarled. He nodded at Miller. "Do it." Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to stretch, to warp. Sarah closed her eyes, a silent prayer on her lips. A shot rang out, but it wasn't Miller's gun. The sound was deeper, more authoritative. It came from the road. Miller cried out, dropping his pistol as he clutched his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Jackson spun around his hand, flying to his own gun, only to find himself staring down the barrel of Marshal Corbin's rifle. The marshal sat calmly on his horse. 2 deputies fanned out behind him, their own weapons, trained on the scene. "Having some trouble, gentlemen?" Corbin asked, his voice laced with a cold, triumphant amusement. Jackson stared, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. He was trapped. He slowly raised his hands. Corbin dismounted his boots, crunching on the dusty ground. He walked over to Miller, who was writhing in pain, and kicked his gun away. He then turned his gaze on Caleb, a slow, appraising look. "Caleb Blackwood," Corbin said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I've been looking forward to our official introduction. You've caused me a great deal of trouble. These are the men who killed my brother Caleb," said his voice tight with emotion. "They tried to kill me. They confessed it. You heard them." "I heard a lot of things," Corbin said. His eyes glinting, he gestured to the ledger tucked in his coat. "But my most reliable source tells me you're a murderer, that you killed a deputy." "He's alive," Caleb insisted desperately. "I shot him in the leg, that's all. It was self-defense." Corbin shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. "His word against yours. And you, my friend, are a known associate of criminals." He nodded towards Jackson and Miller, who were being bound by the deputies. "This little reunion just proves it." It was a setup, a perfectly orchestrated trap. Corbin had used the information about Jackson and Miller to lure them all into one place. He wasn't interested in justice for Elias Blackwood. He was interested in closing his case, tying up loose ends. He wanted to hang Caleb for the deputy's shooting and take credit for capturing the notorious Blackwood gang. "You're under arrest, Blackwood," Corbin announced, pulling out a pair of manacles, "for the attempted murder of a lawman." Caleb looked at Sarah, a silent, heart-breaking apology in his eyes. He had tried to build a fortress, but the serpent had been inside the walls all along. She had let him in. Her deal with Corbin, the devil's bargain she had made to save her inn, had ultimately damned the man who rebuilt it. As the deputies dragged Caleb away, he looked back at the traveller's rest, at the solid porch, and the steady railings, the work of his own hands. He had rebuilt an inn, but his own life was once again in ruins, and Sarah was left alone in the beautiful, silent prison they had created, the echoes of the gunshot, and her own betrayal ringing in her ears. The silence that followed their departure was a suffocating weight. The dust settled, the blood on the porch began to dry in the relentless sun, and Sarah was left with the hollow shell of the life she had briefly, foolishly allowed herself to hope for. The inn, once a symbol of renewal, now felt like a monument to her failure. Every smooth plank, every clean pane of glass was a testament to the man she had just watched being dragged away in chains. Guilt was a physical entity, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. Her bargain with Corbin, born of desperation, had been a poison that had finally reached the heart of everything. She had traded a book of lies for her home, and in doing so had condemned an innocent man. But beneath the guilt, a new feeling was taking root, a slow, burning anger. Anger at Corbin for his casual cruelty and manipulative games, anger at Jackson and Miller for their greed and violence, and anger at herself for her weakness, for her willingness to sacrifice another's freedom for her own. She would not let it end like this. That evening she saddled the old mare in the barn, her movements stiff but determined. She packed a small bag with water food and the last of her savings. She had no clear plan, only a single driving purpose. She had to get to Prescott before Corbin did. The ride was a grueling 2-day journey through harsh, unforgiving terrain. She pushed the mare and herself to the point of exhaustion, fueled by coffee and a desperate, burning resolve. She thought of Caleb, of his quiet strength, his gentle hands, the way he had looked at her before they took him away. She was not just fighting for his life. She was fighting for the truth. She was fighting to reclaim the part of herself she had sold to Marshal Corbin. She arrived in Prescott covered in dust, her body aching, but her spirit ablaze. The town was a bustling hub of commerce and law, a stark contrast to her isolated existence. She went straight to the Territorial Marshal's office, a formidable stone building that housed the highest law in the region. Her request to see the head marshal was met with dismissive skepticism by a bored clerk, but Sarah refused to be turned away. She spoke with a conviction that was so fierce, so unyielding, that it eventually earned her an audience with Marshal David Blaisdell, a stern, weary-looking man with intelligent eyes. She told him everything. She started with the knock on the door during the storm, and didn't stop. She confessed to hiding Caleb, to the blood on the floor, to the lie she had told Corbin. She told him about the ledger, the monstrous lie she had concocted about her own husband to save herself and how Corbin had used it to blackmail her. She recounted the events of the past month, the rebuilding of the inn, Caleb's story of his brother's murder, and the final brutal trap Corbin had set. She laid her soul bare, confessing her crimes, her lies, her fears. She knew she could be arrested, that she could lose everything. But for the first time in a long time, she felt free. The truth, however costly, was a cleaner burden to bear than the lies she had been living with. Blaisdell listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He asked a few sharp, pointed questions, testing the details of her story, his eyes never leaving hers. When she was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "You realize the gravity of these accusations, Mrs. Jenkins?" he said, his voice low. "You are accusing a decorated marshal of blackmail, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. You are confessing to aiding a fugitive." "I am telling the truth," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "It's all I have left." Just then the door opened and a deputy leaned in. "Marshal Corbin is here with the prisoners, sir." Blaisdell's eyes held Sarah's for a long moment. "Wait here," he commanded, and then he was gone. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Sarah sat alone in the office, the fate of 2 men, and her own being decided in the next room. She could hear the muffled sounds of voices, Corbin's booming, self-congratulatory tones, and Blaisdell's sharp, questioning responses. Finally, the door opened again. Blaisdell stood there, his face grim. "Come with me, Mrs. Jenkins." He led her into the main bullpen. Corbin was there, looking smug. Jackson and Miller were in a holding cell, looking sullen and bruised, and Caleb was there standing in manacles, his face etched with exhaustion, but his head held high. When he saw Sarah, a look of profound shock followed by a dawning understanding crossed his face. Marshal Blaisdell Corbin said, his voice oozing confidence, "This is the woman I told you about, a known accomplice. She'll testify against Blackwood, I'm sure of it." "That won't be necessary," John Blaisdell said, his voice cold as steel. He turned to a young deputy who had been shot in the leg some weeks prior and was just returning to duty. "Deputy Allen, take a look at this man Blackwood. Is this the man who shot you?" The young deputy looked at Caleb, then at Corbin, his expression nervous. "Well, sir, he was the one I was fighting with." But what, son?" Blaisdell pressed gently. "But the shot," the deputy finally mumbled, avoiding Corbin's furious glare. "It came from behind me, from up on the ridge. I thought it was one of my own men in the confusion." A stunned silence fell over the room. Corbin's face went from smug to shocked to a mask of pure rage. Blaisdell then turned to Jackson. "And you, Mr. Jackson, you were overheard admitting to the murder of Elias Blackwood. You seem to have a lot to say when you think you hold all the cards." He produced the ledger Sarah had told him about, which he'd retrieved from Corbin's belongings. "But this ledger, it's empty. Just a blank book. Almost as if it were a prop in a desperate play." Corbin paled. His bluff had been called. Marshal John Corbin Blaisdell's voice rang out with authority. "You are under arrest for suspicion of blackmail and conspiracy. Take him away." The look of utter disbelief on Corbin's face was something Sarah would never forget. As 2 deputies, their expressions a mixture of shock and reluctance, took their superior officer into custody. Blaisdell walked over to Caleb and unlocked his manacles. "You're free to go, Mr. Blackwood," Blaisdell said. "It seems you're the victim in all of this. I'll be launching a full investigation into your brother's death. Jackson and Miller won't be going anywhere for a very long time." He then looked at Sarah, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his tired eyes. "As for you, Mrs. Jenkins, given the circumstances and your full cooperation, I'm inclined to believe you've paid your debt. Go home." Freedom felt as strange and disorienting as captivity. Caleb stood there, rubbing his wrists, his gaze fixed on Sarah. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. The noise and chaos of the marshal's office fading into the background. There were no words to encompass what had passed between them. No way to articulate the journey from that stormy night to this stunning, sun-drenched moment of deliverance. "You came for me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You rebuilt my inn," she replied, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. "I owed you a debt." He reached out his calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. I think he said softly, his blue eyes holding hers, "We're even." And in that simple touch, in that shared gaze, a new bargain was struck. Not one of desperation or debt, but one of mutual respect, of shared survival of a future that was for the first time theirs to build together. The journey back to the Traveller's Rest was the polar opposite of Sarah's frantic ride to Prescott. They traveled slowly, letting the horses choose their own pace, the silence between them comfortable and deep. The harsh landscape, once a symbol of her struggle, now seemed beautiful, painted in the soft hues of dawn and dusk. It was a world of possibility again. When the inn came into view, nestled in its shallow valley, it looked different. It stood straight and proud, the new porch like a welcoming embrace, the windows glinting in the afternoon sun. It was no longer a cage or a ruin. It was a home, their home. The days that followed were quiet, peaceful, dedicated to the simple, satisfying work of living. Caleb finished his repairs, his hammering no longer a secret rhythm in the night, but a cheerful domestic sound in the daylight. He rebuilt the collapsed section of the barn, mended the fences, and cleared a patch of stubborn, rocky ground for a garden. Sarah worked alongside him, her hands, once soft and unused to labor, becoming strong and capable. She planted vegetables in the garden he had prepared, her laughter mixing with the sound of his saw. She reopened the inn, not out of financial desperation, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Word of Marshal Corbin's downfall and Caleb's exoneration had spread through the territory like a brush fire. It was a tale of corruption, brought down by the courage of an ordinary woman, a story of justice finally served. It transformed the Traveller's Rest from a forgotten outpost into a place of minor legend. Travelers started to come again. Not the hard, suspicious men of the past, but families, prospectors, merchants. They came for a hot meal, a clean bed, and to catch a glimpse of the quiet, handsome man who worked the grounds and the resilient widow with the unwavering gaze who ran the establishment. They came seeking not just shelter, but a piece of the hope that the inn now seemed to embody. The common room, once a dusty mausoleum of grief, was now filled with the warm buzz of conversation and the clatter of plates. Caleb and Sarah worked together, a seamless team. He would carry in fresh firewood, his quiet presence a steadying force, and she would move between the tables, her smile genuine, her spirit light. One evening, after the last of the guests had retired for the night, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool and smelled of dust and the new life in Sarah's garden. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. The search for silver, the promise of a fortune. Caleb was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the distant dark shape of the mountains. "I miss my brother," he said, his voice low. "I'll always miss him. But the silver, that was his dream more than mine. My dream was just to build something that would last alongside him." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes clear and full of a deep, abiding warmth. "I think I've found that here, Sarah." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His grasp was firm, his calloused palm a perfect fit against hers. It wasn't a gesture of passion or romance, but something deeper, more solid. It was a gesture of partnership, of belonging. Sarah's heart, so long a hollow, aching void, felt full. The ghosts of the past, Thomas, the debt, the fear had finally been laid to rest. The life she had now was not the one she had planned, but it was a good life, a real life, forged in fire and rebuilt with truth and trust. She had taken pity on a fugitive, a desperate, wounded man who had stumbled out of the storm, and in return he had not only rebuilt her inn, he had rebuilt her world. He had shown her that even in the most unforgiving wilderness, after the most brutal of storms, something strong and beautiful could grow. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her gaze following his to the star-dusted horizon. The sign out front, its letters still faded, but its hinges strong, swung gently in the night breeze. The Traveler's Rest. It had finally lived up to its name. For two lost souls, it had become the ultimate sanctuary. It had become home. The story of Sarah Jenkins and Caleb Blackwood is a powerful reminder that our lowest moments can be the foundation for our greatest strengths. It's a testament to the fact that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it, and that true wealth isn't measured in silver, but in the trust and loyalty we build with others. Their journey through betrayal, lies, and loss to find justice and a new beginning in the heart of the unforgiving West speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. If their story of redemption and renewal moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates tales of courage and unexpected love. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic heart of history. Thank you for watching.